My name is Chief Justice Margaret Chin. I'm 52 years old, and I never thought my former colleagues would mock me for being a washed-up husband at the Constitutional Law Conference. But when the Supreme Court bailiff announced my entry as Chief Justice, their laughter died in the most spectacular way possible. Let me take you back to the beginning of the story. Because what happened at the American Constitutional Law Conference was the culmination of 3 years of deliberate obscurity that allowed me to witness the true character of people I had once considered friends and colleagues. I'm Chief Justice Margaret Chin, and for the past 3 years, I've been living in what the legal world considered professional exile. After serving as a respected federal appellate judge for 15 years, I had seemingly vanished from the prestigious legal circles that had once celebrated my judicial brilliance. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more strategic. 3 years ago, I was secretly approached by a bipartisan group of senators and the outgoing Chief Justice with an unprecedented proposition. The Supreme Court was facing a crisis of public confidence due to recent ethical scandals and partisan divisions. They needed someone who could restore dignity and unity to the court, someone who was brilliant, incorruptible, and had the respect of both conservative and liberal legal scholars. But there was a catch. The nomination would be so controversial and the confirmation process so brutal that I would need to completely disappear from public legal life for several years. No high-profile cases, no speaking engagements, no prestigious law review articles. I would need to become invisible to the legal establishment while a carefully orchestrated campaign was built to support my eventual nomination as Chief Justice. The plan required me to take what appeared to be a massive step backward in my career. I resigned from the federal appellate court and took a position as an adjunct professor at a small regional law school in Vermont. To the legal world, it looked like I had suffered some kind of professional breakdown or scandal that forced me into academic exile. My cover story was perfect. Judge Margaret Chin, the former rising star of the federal judiciary, had burned out from the pressures of high-level judicial work and retreated to a quiet teaching position where she could rediscover her passion for law, away from the spotlight. For 3 years, I endured the whispers, the pitying looks, and the cruel speculation about what had really happened to derail my once promising career. Former colleagues who had once sought my advice now avoided me at legal conferences. Speaking invitations dried up. My name disappeared from the influential legal publications that had once featured my work prominently. The isolation was necessary but painful. I had to watch from the sidelines as less qualified judges received the promotions and recognition that should have been mine, all while secretly preparing for the most important role in American jurisprudence. The American Constitutional Law Conference was the premier annual gathering of the nation's legal elite. Federal judges, Supreme Court justices, prominent attorneys, and constitutional scholars came together to discuss the latest developments in American law. For 15 years, I had been a featured speaker, a respected voice in the most important legal conversations of our time. This year, I was attending as an obscure adjunct professor from Vermont, registered under my teaching credentials and seated in the back rows with other academic nobodies. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me as I watched my former colleagues holding court at the conference, discussing constitutional interpretation and judicial philosophy, topics I had helped shape through my years on the federal bench, but could no longer publicly address without breaking my cover. That's when I encountered the group that would provide the most spectacular vindication of my 3-year sacrifice. During the conference's opening reception, I was standing near the registration table, trying to blend into the background, when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. "My God, is that Margaret Chin over there?" said District Judge Robert Harrison, pointing in my direction while talking to a group of prominent attorneys and federal judges. "It is," replied Appeals Court Judge Sandra Williams with barely concealed glee. "Look how pathetic she's become." From federal appellate judge to adjunct professor at some no-name school in Vermont. The group turned to stare at me with the kind of morbid fascination people reserve for watching car accidents. "What do you think really happened to her?" asked Thomas Morrison, a partner at one of Washington's most prestigious law firms. "Judges don't just voluntarily step down from the federal bench to teach at community colleges." "I heard she had some kind of mental breakdown," Sandra continued, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent me from hearing every cruel word. The pressure of federal court work was too much for her. Classic case of someone who rose above her natural abilities. Judge Harrison nodded sagely. It's actually kind of sad. She used to be such a respected voice in constitutional law. Now look at her, hiding in the back of the room like she doesn't belong here. She doesn't belong here, Morrison added with a laugh. This conference is for serious legal minds, not washed-up has-beens teaching first-year constitutional law to kids who couldn't get into real law schools. The cruelty of their words was matched only by their complete ignorance of what was actually happening. As they mocked my pathetic career decline, I was exactly 1 week away from being nominated as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. But the worst was yet to come. Appeals Court Judge Patricia Rodriguez joined the group, having clearly been briefed on their target of ridicule. Margaret Chin, she said loudly enough for half the reception to hear. I was just hearing about your career transition. Teaching must be so fulfilling after federal court work. The condescension in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. It has its rewards, I replied quietly, maintaining my cover perfectly. I'm sure it does, Patricia continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Though it must be difficult adjusting to such a different environment. I imagine the intellectual stimulation isn't quite what you're used to. Judge Harrison couldn't resist joining the public humiliation. We were just discussing how the federal judiciary has evolved since you stepped away, he said with a cruel smile. It's remarkable how quickly the legal landscape moves on without certain voices. The group around us had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle of a former federal judge being publicly mocked by her replacement-level colleagues. I could see people taking out their phones, probably to capture video of my humiliation for social media. The truth is, Margaret, Sandra Williams said with false concern, we're all just surprised to see you here. This conference is really intended for practicing judges and active legal scholars. I'm not sure what someone in your current position would gain from attending. The implication was clear. I no longer belonged among serious legal minds. Perhaps there are conferences more suited to your current level of practice, Morrison added helpfully. Community college educator events, maybe? Continuing education for adjunct faculty. The laughter from the group was humiliating and public. I felt every eye in the reception hall focused on my degradation, watching as former colleagues took turns mocking the pathetic fall of Margaret Chin. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message that would change everything. It was from Senator Charles Bradley, the Judiciary Committee chairman. Nomination announcement moved up to tomorrow morning. President wants you at White House at 8 a.m. for Rose Garden ceremony. Chief Justice Roberts will administer oath next week. Congratulations, Chief Justice Chin. I looked around at the group of judges and attorneys who were still finding new ways to humiliate me, completely unaware that they were mocking the woman who would soon be the most powerful judge in America. But I decided to let them continue for just a little longer. You're right, I said quietly, playing my role perfectly. I'm probably out of my depth here. Finally, some self-awareness, Harrison said with a laugh. Recognition of limitations is the first step toward, well, accepting your new reality. Just then, the conference coordinator approached our group with an apologetic expression. Excuse me, she said, but I need to make an announcement to everyone in the hall. The reception quieted as she moved to the microphone at the front of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but I've just received word from Washington that affects tomorrow's schedule. The room fell silent as legal professionals strained to hear what might impact their conference. Due to a major announcement expected from the White House tomorrow morning regarding the Supreme Court, we're adjusting our keynote session. We've been asked to accommodate some special guests who will be arriving tonight. That's when the doors to the reception hall opened and two figures entered who made every person in the room freeze in recognition: Chief Justice John Roberts and Associate Justice Elena Kagan. The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, drinks paused halfway to lips, and every eye in the room focused on the unexpected arrival of sitting Supreme Court justices. Chief Justice Roberts walked directly toward our group, his presence commanding absolute attention. Justice Kagan followed, scanning the room until her eyes found me. Chief Justice Chin, Roberts said clearly, using the title that nobody in the room expected to hear, "Congratulations on your nomination. The court looks forward to working under your leadership." The silence in the reception hall was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop as 300 of America's most prominent legal minds tried to process what they had just witnessed. Justice Kagan stepped forward with a warm smile. "Margaret, the entire court is thrilled about your nomination as Chief Justice. Your constitutional scholarship and judicial philosophy will bring exactly the kind of leadership we need." The group that had been mocking me just minutes earlier stood frozen in complete shock. Judge Harrison's mouth was hanging open, Sandra Williams looked like she might faint, and Thomas Morrison appeared to be having some kind of existential crisis. "Thank you, Justice Roberts, Justice Kagan," I replied professionally. "I'm honored by the President's confidence and look forward to serving." Chief Justice Roberts turned to address the stunned reception crowd. "For those who haven't heard the news yet, President Biden will announce tomorrow morning that Judge Margaret Chin has been nominated to serve as the 18th Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court." The reception hall erupted in chaos. People were pulling out phones, frantically calling colleagues, and trying to understand how the woman they thought was a washed-up husband was about to become the most powerful judge in America. Justice Kagan wasn't finished with her explanation. Chief Justice Chen's apparent retreat from public legal life over the past 3 years was actually part of a carefully planned preparation for this role. She's been working with constitutional scholars and former justices to develop the judicial philosophy and leadership approach that will guide the court through the next decade. I looked directly at the group that had just finished humiliating me, their faces cycling through emotions I couldn't even identify. The teaching position in Vermont, Roberts continued, allowed Chief Justice Chin to work directly with the next generation of lawyers while developing innovative approaches to constitutional education that she'll bring to the court. Judge Harrison found his voice first, though it came out as a weak whisper. "Chief Justice? You're going to be Chief Justice?" "Pending Senate confirmation, yes," I replied calmly. "The vote is scheduled for next week." Sandra Williams tried to recover. "Margaret, we had no idea." "Congratulations, this is wonderful news for the court." "Thank you, Sandra," I said with the same quiet dignity I'd maintained throughout their public mockery. "Though I have to say, your comments about my pathetic career decline and mental breakdown were particularly creative." The color drained from her face as she realized that her cruel speculation had been directed at the next Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Morrison stepped forward desperately. "Chief Justice Chin, please understand, we didn't know." "You didn't know because you assumed," I replied gently but firmly. "You assumed that because my career path didn't look like traditional success, I must have failed. You mocked me for teaching law students instead of trying to understand why someone might choose that path." Justice Kagan nodded approvingly. Chief Justice Chen's work with students over the past 3 years has been groundbreaking. She's developed new methods for teaching constitutional interpretation that will influence legal education for decades. The reception crowd had pressed closer, everyone straining to hear the conversation between Supreme Court justices and the woman they'd just learned would soon be their boss in the federal judiciary. Patricia Rodriguez made one last desperate attempt at damage control. "Chief Justice Chin, I hope you understand that our comments were taken out of context. We all have tremendous respect for your judicial record. Do you, Patricia?" I asked quietly. "Because just 10 minutes ago, you suggested that I didn't belong at this conference and should perhaps attend community college educator events instead." The humiliation on her face was complete and public. Every person in that reception hall had witnessed her cruel mockery of a Supreme Court Chief Justice nominee. Chief Justice Roberts cleared his throat diplomatically. "Well, I think this has been an illuminating evening for everyone. Chief Justice Chin, we should probably discuss tomorrow's announcement." As we moved toward a quiet corner of the reception hall, I could hear the explosive chatter behind us. The legal establishment was frantically trying to process the revelation that they had just witnessed the public humiliation of America's next Chief Justice. The next morning, the President's Rose Garden announcement made international headlines. The story of the obscure law professor who turned out to be a Chief Justice nominee became a sensation, particularly when video emerged of my former colleagues mocking me at the conference just hours before the nomination was revealed. Judge Harrison, Sandra Williams, Thomas Morrison, and Patricia Rodriguez all became unwitting symbols of professional arrogance and the danger of judging others by appearances. Their cruel comments were quoted in every major newspaper and legal publication in the country. The Senate confirmation hearing was a masterpiece of legal scholarship and judicial philosophy. My 3 years of exile had given me time to develop comprehensive approaches to constitutional interpretation that impressed even my harshest critics. When I was sworn in as Chief Justice 3 weeks later, the ceremony was attended by President Biden, congressional leadership, and the full Supreme Court. The legal establishment that had mocked my pathetic career decline was now celebrating my historic appointment. But the most satisfying moment came during my first day presiding over oral arguments. As I entered the Supreme Court chamber and the bailiff announced, "All rise for the Honorable Chief Justice of the United States," I saw familiar faces in the gallery, the same judges and attorneys who had publicly humiliated me at the conference. They rose respectfully as protocol demanded, but I could see the recognition in their eyes of just how completely they had misjudged the situation. After the session, Judge Harrison approached me privately. "Chief Justice Chin," he said quietly, "I owe you an enormous apology for my behavior at the conference. What we said was inexcusable." "Robert," I replied gently, "you said what you believed. You assumed that unconventional choices meant professional failure. But sometimes the most important work requires stepping away from traditional markers of success." "I'll never make that mistake again," he said sincerely. "I hope not," I replied, "because the law is too important to be left to people who can't see beyond appearances." 6 months into my tenure as Chief Justice, the court has already handed down 3 landmark decisions that will shape American jurisprudence for generations. My 3 years of pathetic exile have informed every aspect of my judicial philosophy and leadership approach. The judges who mocked my teaching career now cite my educational innovations in their own courtrooms. The attorneys who suggested I didn't belong at legal conferences now seek audiences to discuss constitutional interpretation with the Chief Justice. And every time I walk into the Supreme Court chamber and hear, "All rise for Chief Justice Chin," I remember that conference reception where my former colleagues pointed and laughed at how pathetic I had become. Sometimes the most pathetic thing you can do is underestimate someone whose path you don't understand. And sometimes the person you're mocking is about to become the most powerful judge in America. The gavel of justice has a sense of irony like that.